Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 290. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well. Happy to have you back on the show for another Iran update this week. Although I do got a little bit of Russian news to get through this week because Joe Biden went and sent another $1 billion of weapons to Ukraine. So we definitely have to talk about that, Connor. But we also have to mention where people can find and share the show. It's at the Libertarian Institute, where Connor is one of our great writers and I am the news editor, which means you can also find the show on the Libertarian Institute All podcast feed. The show also has its own audio podcast feed anywhere you can listen to podcasts. You can find the video version on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. You can follow the show on Twitter at Con_interest for the show. You can follow me at Kyle Anzalone_. Connor, what's your Twitter handle?
At Freeman's Mind 96.
All right, and then you can support the show by donating. We take crypto, that information in the show notes page, also the links to the Patreon Subscribe Star. You can also help out the show by doing your CBD shopping at our sponsor, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Connor, what do you like from Paloma Verde?
I really love the soft gels. You take them after meals, and they'll knock out any kind of inflammation, pain, any kind of if you have some anxiety, it can even help with like concentration, focus, and fatigue or anything like that. Kicks in real fast, and the gummy bears are delicious. Those will kick in instantly, and you can take them on the go, obviously. And then the tinctures that's usually what I get because that's the strongest stuff. And it lasts the longest, and the mint flavor is delicious. So definitely check all those out. Can't recommend them enough.
All right, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. And Connor, the first article I have today is from myself and Will Porter, June 16th at the Libertarian Institute. Turkey and Russia suggest path for grain ships to access Ukrainian ports. Ankara and Moscow have put forward a potential solution to reopen Ukraine's Black Sea ports, with Russia offering safe passage to ships, while Turkey said it could help guide vessels around Ukrainian naval mines deployed to stall the Russian advance. Russia's UN ambassador told reporters on Wednesday that the Kremlin is open to creating safe passage for grain shipments, but said that Moscow could not guarantee the route would be free of mines. We are not responsible for establishing safe corridors. We said we could provide safe passages if these corridors are established. He said it's obvious that it's either demining the territory which has been mined by the Ukrainians or ensure that the passage goes around those mines. While Turkey has said it would take some time to clear away the munitions, Foreign Minister from Turkey suggested safe corridors could be found in some Ukrainian ports, presenting the offer to a short-term solution. And he said, since the location of the mines is known, certain safe lines would be established to 3 ports, the foreign minister said early on Wednesday, adding the ships could come and go safely to ports without a need to clear mines. The foreign minister went on to say that Ankara has not received a response from the Kremlin on the proposal, but is currently working with the United Nations on the plan. A UN spokesperson confirmed that discussions were underway, though noted that the agreement from both Ukraine and Russia would be needed to move forward. Turkey's national defense minister, meanwhile, told TRT that 3 nations recently created an emergency communications mechanism to resolve the problems and reopen Ukraine's ports, but it's not yet clear whether any progress has been made in negotiations. Last Sunday, President Recep Erdogan, that's the president of Turkey, also announced that he plans to hold 3-way dialogue on the issue of Russian and Ukrainian counterparts sometime in the coming weeks after Ankara hosted several rounds of lower-level peace talks. Kiev, however, has signaled it will not accept the Russian or Turkish proposals. Speaking at an event on Washington, a Ukrainian lawmaker and head of the negotiation team said, our military people are against demining the ports, so that's why we have very, very limited optimism for this model. The UN has warned that disruption of grain exports from Ukraine could have a massive impact on the global food supplies. Together, Moscow and Kiev provide up to 40% of Eastern Europe grain purchases and make up an even greater part of the country's total imports. While Ukrainian and American officials have recently blamed Russia for the shortages, Moscow has rejected the charge, instead pinning the scarcities on U.S. sanctions and explosives still deployed in key seaports. The Kremlin previously offered to help establish a safe route for shipping vessels in exchange for sanctions relief, but Washington refused to take up the deal. The U.S. and its Western partners have attempted to cripple the Russian economy through heavy sanctions in response to the invasion, some pledging outright embargoes on the country's energy exports, while the penalties initially sent the ruble tumbling. It has since made a significant comeback, now among the best performing currencies against the dollar in 2022. Meanwhile, the White House is now quietly pushing U.S. shipping companies to do business with Russian fertilizer suppliers. The conflict raging in Eastern Europe has not severed all business ties between Moscow and Kiev, as Ukraine's state-run gas company has continued to work with the Russian equivalent Gazprom. Though the two firms have reportedly done hundreds of millions in trade since the war kicked off in February, the shaky truce could soon fracture, as the Ukrainian company now is pursuing a lawsuit against Gazprom for alleging underpayment. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the sanctions. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Biden offers concerned Russian sanctions hurting ordinary people more than Putin. This is, again, from Dave DeCamp. Bloomberg reported on Tuesday that some Biden administration officials are privately expressing concern that sanctions on Russia are worsening the global food crisis, exacerbating inflation, and hurting ordinary Russians more than President Vladimir Putin and his inner circle, which, of course, is exactly what we predicted would happen on this show when the U.S. put this policy in place. And Dave basically writes that in his article, that if you look at everywhere these sanctions have taken place, it doesn't do what the U.S. wants it to and just hurts the ordinary people. And he also has, according to the Yale Chief Executive Leadership Institute, about 1,000 companies have ended or limited their business in Russia. This has left assets behind that the Russian government could now take control of and let markets open that Russian firms can now enter with less competition. And there's a really good article in the American Conservative by Dimitri Simes that we ran, I believe, as a spotlight in Anti-War this week on this particular issue, Connor. And Simes really goes into it and explains how different sectors are going to respond differently, but why the Russian economy is going to recover okay. And of course, on the last episode of the show, I talked about how the U.S. was now encouraging U.S. fertilizer shipping companies to buy Russian fertilizer because the sanctions have blunted the economies between Russia and the U.S. so much and hurting global food supplies. So now to some of the most recent news. Biden announces $1 billion weapons package for Ukraine. Dave DeCamp wrote this up at antiwar.com yesterday. President Biden has announced after a call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that the U.S. is sending Ukraine a new $1 billion weapons package, the largest single arms shipment Washington will be providing Kiev since Russia invaded on February 24th. And here is a list of what is included. 18 155 millimeter howitzers, 36,000 rounds for those howitzers, 18 tactical vehicles to tow the howitzers, additional ammunition for high mobility artillery rocket systems, 4 tactical vehicles to recover equipment, spare parts and other equipment, 2 Harpoon coastal defense systems, thousands of secure radios, thousands of night vision devices, thermal sights, and other optics, funding for training, maintenance, sustainment, transportation, and administrative costs. Connor, maybe the most notable thing on that list, of course, are the Harpoon defense systems. These are anti-ship missiles, and in the past, there was a Ukrainian official who said that the U.S. was working on a plan to use these against Russia and to break the blockade in the Black Sea with these missiles. Now, the U.S. is giving Ukraine the more and more weapons, but even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, admitted on Wednesday that the numbers favor Russia in Ukraine as Russia's forces continue to make slow progress against Ukrainian forces. And this is what he said. I would say the numbers clearly favor Russia in terms of artillery. In terms of artillery, they do outgun and outrange, and that is the war that Russia is currently fighting in the Donbass region, using its artillery to loosen up the Ukrainian positions and then move in and take them over. Now, we have the highest so far estimate made by Ukrainian officials on their casualties. We have reported in Axios that Ukrainian officials said up to 1,000 soldiers are being killed or wounded every day in the Donbass of Ukraine, with 200 to 500 killed on average. And these numbers are really high, Connor. I was very surprised by it. Now, interestingly enough, when Mark Milley gave that testimony, he said the numbers were only 100 dead and 300 casualties total. So, about 3 times lower than the Ukrainian estimates. Now, this could be like intelligence failures on the U.S. part, where we just don't know what's going on in Ukraine. But it could also be indicating that the U.S. and Ukraine are pushing different levels of propaganda right now, where the U.S. is trying to make it look like it can't make it look too catastrophic, of course, because then Americans and our allies may lose interest in the effort. At the same time, on the Ukrainian side, maybe they really need to look desperate in order to get the weapons and more upgraded weapons and really put the pressure on the West to donate those. So the Axios article says Zelensky said on June 1st that 60 to 100 Ukrainian troops were being killed daily. Over the past 2 weeks, that number has climbed significantly, according to the head of Ukraine's negotiation team and one of Zelensky's closest advisors. And then I did note in my Twitter thread on this that Kiev has used conscripts in the fight against Russia. And so I know there's a lot of people, even in the libertarian circles, Connor, that like to pretend like, oh, Russia's just killing Nazis. Men 18 to 65 aren't allowed to leave Ukraine. So I'm guessing a lot of those are who, the bodies that are actually, being left on the battlefield right now. Maybe some of the more extremist white nationalist types are using these people essentially as cannon fodder. Now, the next article from Dave DeCamp on June 15th at antiwar.com, House Democrat slams too cautious approach to Ukrainian military aid. Yes, Connor, this is almost believable. Adam Smith, the head of the House Armed Services Committee, slammed the Biden administration's Ukraine military aid policy, calling it too cautious. He said, Ukraine's borders Russia. If you give them a mortar shell, it could go a mile. Theoretically, it could strike Russia, Smith said. The point of giving them the weapons is not to be able to strike into Russia. The point is to be able to hit Russians who are in Ukraine from a longer, safer distance. And so this is just a very interesting, almost conflicting statement to make, but very disturbing that we're hearing it from such a powerful member of Congress. Since Russia has invaded Ukraine, the U.S. has stepped up its funding on the info war. Dave DeCamp writes, since Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. has increased funding for technology companies to help Russians get around internet censorship and access U.S.-funded state media, Reuters reported. Since February, the funding for 3 VPN companies has increased by nearly half. The financing is done through Open Technology Fund, a nonprofit funded entirely by the U.S. government that Washington uses to support protests in other countries by giving them tools to avoid surveillance and get around internet censorship. And so that's basically just taking money from the Pentagon. Let's see, I got just a couple more articles here, Connor. The next one from Dave DeCamp report, Baltic states won't get the massive military buildup they want. Dave says Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were looking for about 6,000 troops each, but each Baltic country only has about 2,000, and reports from 7 unnamed senior diplomats, this according to Reuters and officials from NATO, said that is not likely, that they're not going to get 6,000. They're not going to be able to create their own division. And then the last article I have here on the Russia issue is Ukraine says it needs $5 billion in monthly external aid to avoid budget cut. Now, first of all, Connor, I think if a country's at war, we can't like live in this delusional world that you're not going to have to face budget cuts in other areas. Now, Russia inflicted this war on Ukraine. That's unfortunate, but you're going to have budget cuts. But at the same time, I'm sure they do need additional funding and everything like that. And it does seem strange that the Western countries are more willing to offer military aid, guns, ammunition, than just about anything else. And so, I don't know, maybe Ukraine will start selling off some of these Javelin missiles in order to raise some funds for the other things that they need, because like I said, I really don't think they're going to get this much in direct money from the Western countries. So far, according to Ukraine, they've only gotten about $5 billion since between January and May. So that's even past the Russian invasion. That's 5.2 billion. So it seems unlikely they're going to get what they want on this, but they might get a little bit more. And Connor, I will now turn it over to you to update us on what's happening with the Iran deal and the potential for talks to have success, or I guess failure at this point seems more likely.
Yeah, unfortunately. But okay, so after last week, after that IAEA Board of Governors meeting, and there was this resolution put forward by the U.S. and the E3, which was highly provocative over this controversy we've covered quite a bit lately about the undeclared sites that had these traces of unprocessed uranium. They're originally identified by Israel, of course. The Iranians had turned in their reports, and so now it still wasn't enough. The IAEA is being pushed by the U.S. and increasingly Tel Aviv, and we discussed why the Europeans are also doing this, but for probably other motives. But regardless, the result is the same. So, as we said at the end of the show last week, Iran started to remove cameras from various IAEA sites around the country. And they decided to announce that they were going to be building or installing more advanced centrifuges. So this is from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Iran blasts unconstructive IAEA censure and announces retaliation. So the Iranian Foreign Ministry criticized and denounced the IAEA's adoption of that censure put forward by the U.S. and the E3 last week. At the Board of Governors meeting, Tehran said it was a political, unconstructive, and incorrect action. The ministry statement adds the adoption of the resolution, which is based on the hasty and unbalanced report of the Director General of the IAEA and on false and fabricated information from the Zionist regime, will only weaken the process of cooperation and interaction between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the agency. Iran has taken reciprocal, practical steps due to the non-constructive approach of the agency and the adoption of the resolution, including the installation of advanced centrifuges and the deactivation of cameras. I'll just add that Hossein Amir Abdollahian, the Iranian foreign minister, made this same point on a phone call with the UN Secretary General recently, that the report by Grassi and his agency was hasty and unbalanced. Now, the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, in a statement, of course, stressed that they're continuing to abide by the IAEA Safeguards Agreement under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Saeed Khatizbeda, the Foreign Ministry spokesman, tweeted that the initiators are responsible for the consequences. Iran's response is firm and proportionate. After Tehran began removing 27 cameras from various nuclear sites, Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, warned that the only outcome of such a path will be a deepening nuclear crisis and further economic and political isolation for Iran. He added the Iranian retaliations were counterproductive and would further complicate our efforts to return to full implementation of the JCPOA. An Iranian nuclear program spokesman said of the IAEA, "We hope they come to their senses and respond to Iran's cooperation with cooperation. It's not acceptable that they show inappropriate behavior while Iran continues to cooperate." President Raisi said, "Do you assume we will withdraw because of resolutions? In the name of God and in the name of the nation, Iran will not withdraw from its stance a single step." On Thursday, the same day as Raisi's comments, Grassi said Iran's responses would deal a fatal blow to negotiations to restore the JCPOA. The E3 put out a statement as well the same day, I would have quoted it, but it was almost verbatim what Blinken said. Again, just showing well, this seems to be a repetitive. This seems to be a pattern, obviously, especially since the talks restarted. Grassi's press conference was particularly provocative and hyperbolic. He claimed Iran's removal of these cameras poses a serious challenge to his agency's efforts, warning in 3 to 4 weeks the UN watchdog will be unable to maintain, quote, continuity of knowledge about Iran's nuclear program. When we lose this, it's anyone's guess, he said. Grassi also said after Iran's response that this would leave 40-something cameras still in Iran. He noted that among the devices being removed was a crucial meter that tracks how high Iran enriches uranium at Natanz. Grassi also said Iran informed the agency that they plan to install 2 new cascades of the IR-6 at Natanz. The IR-6 cascades spin uranium gas to enrich it 10 times faster than the first-generation centrifuges that Iran was limited to under the JCPOA. Iran has been spinning an IR-6 cascade at the underground Fordo facility since February, and the IAEA knows that. And also now there's reportedly 3 more total cascades of that type that are going to be installed at Natanz, including one that Iran had notified the IAEA about long before this issue with the Board of Governors meeting last week. Now, Naftali Bennett, the Israeli prime minister, made a surprise visit to the UAE shortly after this. Bennett made his second public trip to Abu Dhabi since since the Abraham Accords supposedly normalized relations in 2020. He met with Mohammed bin Zayed to discuss various regional issues, but according to a statement from Bennett's office, Iran was likely to top the agenda. There hasn't been much reporting beyond that. Now, Venezuela and Iran have signed a 20-year cooperation deal during Maduro's recent visit to Tehran. This is from Middle East Eye on June 11th. Caracas and Tehran signed a deal for 2 decades, covering cooperation on their energy and financial sectors. It also promises to work together on defense projects. Raisi commended Venezuela for continuing to resist sanctions and said this is a good sign that proves to everyone that resistance will work and will force the enemy to retreat. Beyond the 20-year agreement signed by the country's foreign ministers, they also signed documents committing to cooperation in the political, cultural, economic, tourism, oil, and petrochemical fields. Starting July 18th, direct flights will open between the 2 countries. Maduro said this will promote tourism and union between our countries. Venezuela is open to receive tourists from Iran. At the joint press conference in Tehran, Raisi added, this paves the way for the enhancement of trade and economic relations, as well as bringing the 2 nations closer together. Now, Iran says that their oil sales are strong despite the effect of the Ukraine war, and this is from Al Jazeera. Iran's state-run news agency, IRNA, is reporting that Tehran is now exporting 1 million barrels of crude oil and gas condensate per day, according to Petroleum Ministry data. IRNA and Iran, the government's daily newspaper, said Iran has sold more than last year, 40% more crude oil, 40% more crude, oil derivatives, natural gas, and gas condensate in the first 2 months of the current Iranian calendar year that ended on May 21st compared to the same period last year. Receiving the yields from these sales is an issue, obviously because of the maximum pressure campaign, although according to the outlets, Iran is doing better in that regard than during the previous year. Iran reportedly cashed in $7.5 billion in oil and petrochemical sales in the first 2 months of the Iranian calendar year, 60% higher than last year. The reports credit the increases to the higher oil prices on world markets as a result of the Ukraine war, but they also add that the main reason is the government has secured more oil sales and has seen higher success in actually receiving the money. This comes amid reports that Iranian crude exports have taken a significant hit as a result of Russia responding to Western sanctions by selling its oil at heavy discounts. And selling it particularly in Eastern markets, which is an opportunity that was seized on by China, Iran's greatest buyer of their crude. So China is reportedly scaling back some of their purchases from Iran, although they, of course, are still buying oil from Iran. The Kepler Data and Analytics Company notes that Russia's heavy discounting left nearly 40 million barrels of Iranian oil stored on tankers in Asia without buyers. This stat is a month old. Kepler also said Iran's estimated exports before April dropped below 1 million barrels per day and only experienced a drop due to the effects from the Ukraine war. The IRNA report, however, has Iran's petroleum ministry saying Iran's oil exports will be affected by market changes, but the country will not see drastic drops because only the geography of the market may change. Iran's production capacity is such that it simply cannot offer the same sort of discounts that Russia can, though the petroleum ministry confirmed that they are allocating facilities to make its oil more attractive to buyers. Iran is reportedly producing between 2.5 and 2.8 million barrels per day. The country was producing 4 million barrels per day before the maximum pressure campaign, about half of what it was exporting. Now, as a result of American sanctions, it's extremely difficult, of course, for them to attract investments and technology to develop their oil and gas fields, and many such projects have stalled for years. Now, Iran's currency has also hit a new record low amid nuclear deal uncertainty. So after all the controversy from last week, and then Iran disconnecting the cameras and announcing that they were installing these advanced centrifuges, and then Grassi's comments about how this is a fatal blow, and this could be in 3 to 4 weeks, we're not going to know what's going on, and all this hype. We've seen the rial at a record low. So Iran's currency is now trading at rates close to 330,000 to $1 last weekend on the open market. Now, Iran's nuclear activities are fully reversible. This is from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Iran says that their nuclear activities are fully reversible. This is from June 13th. Iran issued a statement reaffirming that even after removing the cameras and announcing plans for the new centrifuges, all Iran's activities outside the parameters of the deal are fully reversible, that Iran could quickly come back into compliance if a deal is reached. The Foreign Ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh said the U.S. should give up the delusion of leverage and meet its commitments, saying that could yield results. All right, now more Israel stuff. Iran believes Israel killed 2 Iranian scientists with poison. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The New York Times is now reporting this week that Iran believes 2 additional scientists have been killed by Tel Aviv now, including the aeronautical engineer we discussed last week, who died of a poisoning at a dinner party on May 31st. An Iranian official and people close to the government told the Times that Ayub Antazari and Kamran Agamolai, a geologist, were both killed by poisoning around the same time last month. Israeli media reported that Agamolai worked at Natanz, adding to the suspicion of Israeli involvement, though people close to him say he worked for a private geological research company. Mysterious deaths inside Iran are continuing, with Iranian media reporting 2 more men working for the IRGC in the aerospace industry died on unspecified missions over the weekend. Both deaths were labeled as martyrdoms in Iranian media, indicating that Iran believes that they were killed as well. Now, Iran continues to hype the threat in Istanbul and to Israeli citizens and officials around the world, but particularly in Istanbul, they've raised their security. Their National Security Council issued this. I think in Istanbul, it's like a level 4. I forget the exact term, but it's basically a warning. It's like a security warning, and they're saying that get out of Istanbul while you still can. The Iranians are going to kill you. Yair Lapid is saying stuff like this a lot. In fact, he said to those Israelis who were able to get out of Istanbul, you made it. Thank God you made it out with your lives. And there's no evidence to support any of this. This is just more of the same hype about, excuse me, Israel is killing people in Iran and attacking their military facilities with drone strikes and all kinds of things. And then they have to make up this story similar to, Blinken saying that the IRGC is out to try and kill Pompeo. They never offer any evidence. It's just supposed to build up the hype on this IRGC issue, of course, further lessening the chances of a return to the JCPOA. Now, Iran said that any now they're also in response to this stuff about how they keep targeting our people abroad. The Israelis said this about the senior colonel that they assassinated in Tehran. He was part of this unit, this covert unit of the IRGC, Unit 840, I believe, that Iran says doesn't even exist, but supposedly they had all these plots to go and kidnap and murder Israelis around the world. Now, so in the midst of all this hype about the threat to Israelis and Turkey, Tehran said that any revenge would take place not inside a third country. Katz Beta, the foreign ministry spokesman, said, if we will respond to Israel's activities, our answer will be given in its place and not in a third country. All right, so now this is, again, from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Israel wants the U.S. to lead Middle East military buildup against Iran. So on Tuesday, Defense Minister Benny Gantz said, in the face of Iranian belligerence, what is needed is not just cooperation, but also a regional force buildup with American leadership, which would strengthen all parties involved. And this is, of course, a callback to last year's meeting between Bennett and Biden, where Bennett reportedly floated the idea of forming a NATO-style alliance aimed at Tehran, which obviously the Abraham Accords would form the foundation for such an alliance. And last week, of course, as you and Will wrote about at the Institute, the Abraham Accords Caucus introduced a bill in the House and Senate to coordinate missile defense upgrades for Israel and several Arab states to counter alleged Iranian threats. Now, Iran remains hopeful for a nuclear deal after the whole controversy with the IAEA and the rebuke last week. So this is from Jason Ditz. Hossein Amir Abdollahian, the Iranian foreign minister, says that Tehran continues to believe that diplomacy is the best way to reach an agreement. Iran reported that the U.S. accepted a proposal just before the contentious IAEA meeting last week, suggesting, behind the scenes, that there are talks still ongoing despite the heated display. Ned Price's rhetoric, though, has not changed. He says Iran must be willing to, quote, forego non-nuclear issues and return to compliance. And this avoids the issue, of course, of the larger disputes over what sanctions are to be lifted in a return to the deal. Because, of course, the real, the negotiations before all this stuff fell apart in March, the argument was that the whole the agreement, the tacit agreement, and what was near being finalized was that the maximum pressure campaign would be ended, which of course includes more than just nuclear-related sanctions. But that is what the Americans are trying to basically, because they've imposed so many sanctions on Iran over the years, and it's so complicated that they just want to basically say, well, it's just about the nuclear sanctions, and if you want anything else, that's outside the deal. When of course the whole point, as we've talked, the Trump administration and Elliot Abrams and people like Mark Dubowitz orchestrated all of this to ensure that this would be a problem politically on a domestic basis, that the Democrats and any successor to Trump would fear hitting a third rail by being perceived as being soft on terrorism or whatever if they lifted this FTO designation for the IRGC or any of these. There's this sanctions wall basically that they've built up of all these additional sanctions. Abrams was announcing new sanctions as the Iran envoy every week in the last few months of the Trump administration with the explicit intention of creating such a crisis so that in the future we would run into this problem. That's not to say that the Democrats have the will to actually return to the deal. I don't believe that they do, but nevertheless, this was the intended effect. So now we have Yair Lapid now calling on the UN to restore all nuclear sanctions on Iran. He's hoping for the snapback mechanism to be kicked in. So Tel Aviv continues to try to exploit last week's IAEA stunt as much as possible, with Yair Lapid declaring it as proof that diplomacy has failed, which is interesting because the usual rhetoric from the Israelis, including Bennett recently, is that when diplomacy fails, that's when we attack Iran that's where we instigate an attack on Iran and maybe a war in self-defense, of course. He is now demanding the issue be taken to the UN Security Council. This is Lapid, eyeing reimposing every single sanction on Iran using the snapback mechanism. It's not clear at all that this would be popularly supported. Of course, China and Russia would almost certainly veto it, but that's actually, so basically what we were talking about last week was, are they going to bring this issue to the UN Security Council? And if they did that with, absent this whole snapback part, without the snapback mechanism, if they brought this issue to the Security Council, the Russians and the Chinese would almost certainly veto it, and it would be null and void, basically. But with the snapback mechanism, the reason why they want to do that is because that way, Russia and China's veto won't make a difference. You just need one party to the agreement to lodge a complaint. And though it isn't clear the E3 would go along with this, that in all likelihood, I'm assuming, well, worse could come to worse. But at the moment, the E3, I don't see doing this. But even if the Americans wanted to, they can't. They're not a part of the deal anymore. That was one of the big concerns early on that we discussed last year with Trita Parsi's reporting. That was one of the concerns that Iran had when Biden told them, "Hey, I can't promise you I won't reimpose sanctions basically out of nowhere, even if we return to the deal here during the rest of my administration." And that was one of the big concerns, that if they could get back into the deal, the Americans, that is, then they could actually trigger that snapback mechanism themselves, and which would significantly worsen the economic war and the economic crisis in Iran. Now let's see. So regardless, Lapid reiterates that Israel wants Iran isolated from the rest of the world, and he says they're working with the U.S. to accomplish this. Okay, now we talked, I think, 2 weeks ago about the tanker that had been seized by the Americans in Greek waters, and then the Iranian retaliation by seizing 2 Greek tankers. Well, now Greece has ordered the release of that seized tanker. So the Iranian Ports and Maritime Organization reported this week that Greece freed the Iranian tanker Pegasus, which was seized back in April. Athens said that they have ordered the return of the cargo as well. The Greek court overturned the ruling, allowing Washington to confiscate the cargo following Iran's appeal. The U.S. already stole some of the oil last month, so it's doubtful they will get any of that back. But Iran denounced the seizure as piracy immediately, and in retaliation, of course, seized these 2 tankers, these 2 Greek tankers that were carrying Iraqi oil, and they've taken those back to Iran. Raisi said this was very important because the response on the part of Tehran here shows that the era of hit and runs is over. Of course, referring to the U.S. seizing Iranian oil tankers, stealing it, and then selling it, pirating it for profit. All right. Now, that is pretty much everything I have right now. It is... I will have to see. I mean, the only possible thing you could read into this that seems good right now is the fact that there seems to be, or at least according to the Iranians, there was an agreement that was reached with the U.S. Who knows what the details of that? Hopefully, we'll find out soon. But that could imply, as Jason said, that there are talks ongoing at the same time that we see all this bad news more publicly on display. But hopefully we'll hear some better news soon. I think it's becoming more and more clear that the Biden administration just has absolutely no will to return to this deal, and they're going to use this issue with the IAEA to really seal the deal here, to just end it and blame Iran. As we said last week, they're rolling out this more or less this international PR campaign. And I think the IAEA is playing a huge role in that. I mean, for Grassi to basically imply, we're going to be blind here and we're not going to know what's going on, when this is ultimately, for playing ball here with the Americans and the Israelis. They orchestrated this crisis here recently. I mean, the IAEA has been much better than this in the past. But this has become very, very politicized, and now I just fear that, and we can see it already, that this whole issue is going to be seized as a way to basically, justify either killing the deal or, adding more sanctions. It's just going to build up more and more tensions, and we'll have to see where we can go from here. But he's lying when he says all that, because yes, the JCPOA is the most comprehensive inspections regime in history. However, Iran is a decades-long signatory to the NPT, and they still are in compliance with the Safeguards Agreement. Nobody's disputing that. So they absolutely know that they're not building nukes. To just put out this kind of alarmism is clearly designed to worsen tensions and cause more division.
Yeah. And then just real quick, Connor, I did see that Mohammed Sahimi article that was at Responsible Statecraft, where he detailed a quote from Amir Abdollahian about how Iran was still willing to return to the deal and things like that. But I did catch this yesterday from Politico, article titled Iran sanctions could tighten if talks fade. Biden administration officials tell senators during a closed-door hearing. And just a couple interesting quotes from that. Menendez said, "The question is whether leaving the door open to a potential deal is something that's desirable as a strategic position for the administration to say to the world, we tried, here it is, they're unwilling to do it." And then Menendez commenting on Biden administration officials potentially adding sanctions. He said, "I would stay tuned." And Marco Rubio, of course, a major hawk, said that all Iran is seeking is some short-term sanctions release so they can invest more money in their military capabilities. Chris Murphy said, is one of Biden's few allies on policy, and actually said diplomacy is the only path, and I have still yet to hear a single Republican or a single opponent of the 2015 deal articulate a viable alternative path. So a little bit of a good note to end on there, that at least there's one senator that seems to think getting back in the deal is the best potential option, Connor, but is not the overall thoughts on this. Anyways, thanks so much for coming back on the show this week for another Iran update. You got some great articles coming out, so everybody be sure to follow Connor on Twitter at Freeman'sMind96, and then stay tuned to everything at the Libertarian Institute, where Connor is always in the featured articles section. You can find myself in the news roundup section, and then, of course, this show is hosted through the Institute. Thanks, Connor.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everybody.